technology. I do a little intro music. We're cool like that. So apparently we can't hear it. I don't hear it online right now. Welcome, friends. Welcome to Best Video, where we are doing a podcast interview. I'm Reverend Jack Perkins Davidson. I'm the senior pastor at Spring Glen Church across the street. And we do a semi-regular 3 or 4 times a year interview series that I like to call Pastor Jack's Backpack, because I like to interview books that I and books of book that I carry around in my both literal and proverbial backpack. Tonight, I want to first offer gratitude and thanks to our host, Best Video. And for those of you online who are not familiar with the region, yes, this is a video rental store, but it is so much more than that. It is this lovely community center and event space. And so thanks to Julie, the executive director, for hosting us tonight. Also, thanks to the crew from Atticus Bookstore who are selling books in the back. I love that we're supporting local nonprofits, local authors, and local bookstores all at the same time. So let's hear it for that. Yay! Our author tonight is Danielle Chapman. She is the author of 2 collections of poems, Delinquent Palaces from Northwestern University Press in 2015, and Boxed Juice, which will be released from Unbound Edition Press in 2020. Oh my goodness, you've got a memoir and a poetry book coming out. That is amazing. How do you write that much? That's awesome.
Just box juice.
Just box juice. Yeah, it's just ready to go. She teaches Shakespeare and creative writing at Yale University and lives right here in Hamden with her husband, Christian Wyman, and their daughters, Eliza and Fiona, who all appeared in a lovely profile in the New Yorker recently, so you should check that out because that's fun too. So welcome to anybody who's joining us online. Feel free to post in the comments if you have questions, and if we have time, we'll get to those, and if not, maybe we'll jump in the comment thread later to engage with those. I want to turn it over now to our amazing author to do a brief reading for us, to give us a little taste of what we are about to discuss. So you have a sense of the beautiful poetry with which you wrote this memoir. I think that really stuck out for me in reading this book, was how poetic. You are obviously a poet, because the language was just so beautifully crafted, which made the already engaging stories even more engaging. So I'll turn it over to you to take it away.
Okay, thank you. And does this seem to be working? Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you, Julie and Colleen and everybody at Atticus and everybody at Best Video. It's really special and fun to be doing an event that's so local and that I just care about everybody here so much. And so thank you for coming. My book is about a place that's kind of far away, geographically, maybe psychically, and yet in some positive ways and some negative ways, we maybe have more in common with these people than we sometimes think. I'm going to read first from the preface, which gives a sort of introduction to some of the bigger themes of the book. And then I'm going to skip forward to a section. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that once I get there. But first, I'm just going to read this short part from the preface. I didn't want to write more. I didn't want to tie my work or my life to the South of my childhood. I didn't want to trot out the old saws about courage and character impressed on me by my grandfather, the Marine Corps general. And I had no intention of peddling the fantastical, self-flattering tale of his Confederate grandfather and his best friend, the enslaved man who supposedly saved great-great-granddad's life on the battlefield, then went to fight for the Union Army, then came back and saved the whole white family from ruin, which didn't mean that I had no use for myths. I was a poet, after all, but during the decade that it took to write this book, I, like everyone else, was becoming first and foremost a partisan. My Keatsian negative capability was getting fried by my Yeatsian fury, which wanted to escalate every argument into an epic. The only problem was, when I sat down to write progressive prophecy, what came out was wind. Part of the problem was that I knew in my rational mind, if not my amygdala, that the terror I felt, the short circuiting of my American nervous system that occurred between 2016 and 2022 was driven by an assumption that was fundamentally false, that half the country, the other half, was inhuman. I knew this because I was perpetually reminded, usually at the worst possible times, that those people were my family, the ones who raised me and sacrificed for me and made it possible for me to grow up with the opportunity to disagree with them in print. These disagreements tortured me nevertheless, and I made more than one midnight comparison between my own people and the silent majority of the Weimar Republic. But in the end, it always felt unfair and sloppy to treat such complex characters so bluntly. It wasn't just filial piety that stopped me, though, for my scruples extended maybe even more ardently to the crazies. Those unforgettable Southern characters from my childhood who, if they hadn't loved me with such grizzled fervor, I could easily have lumped in with the feller who brought his own crucifixion cross to the Capitol on January 6th. That wild day, riveted, appalled, it was the pain-scorched ones I couldn't look away from. The long-haired, bespectacled blank ones who'd been staring into a screen so long they'd become specimens in jars, goggle-eyed and pickled. The PTS cases in full tactical gear, the desert skulkers, the dieters on dust, the guns for souls who'd shot their own childhoods right in the face. For I knew them. And I knew that despite all their hollering, all their violence and delusion and wrath, they were suffering. In a way, this was the main thing that childhood had trained me for, to see through I met mine chaos of pain, singular point of light within them that begged to be known and loved. I feared going too far down this road, of course. I didn't want to tread anywhere near the both sidesism that Trump and his ilk had turned to their own purposes after Charlottesville. Yet, I'd also begun to realize that my work might not have been political work after all, but something even more hellish. For as Gillian Rose writes in her masterpiece, Love's Work, to live, to love, is to be failed. To forgive, to have failed, to be forgiven forever and ever. Keep your mind in hell and despair not. I was coming to understand that the question which I'd been called was ultimately a metaphysical one. How can heaven and hell exist by jowl in a place, in a person, in a nation's history, and in oneself? I knew that no government would ever be able to answer this question, not even an ideal one, nor would any ideology make the human personalities of my memory stick to the page. As Rose says, there is no democracy in any love relation, only mercy. So I went ahead, wrote the people and the places I came from, hoping that if I could forgive them for what they were, I might be forgiven in return. So that's just the very beginning. And most of the rest of the book is a memoir, however, a somewhat unusual memoir that begins in my early childhood and sort of ends in very early adulthood. The very first story is probably my origin story of my life and also as a poet. And it's the story of when my father, who was a Marine stationed in Okinawa, drowned in a scuba diving accident. And my mother was in the water as well, and she also almost drowned. This is one of my first memories. I was on the beach and I saw this happen. So the way that I sort of work through it in this chapter is exploring the idea that the story that my mother told of her survival and the trauma that she went through was kind of my first poem, my most primal poem. She told it the same way every time. And there was just this urgency to it. And, it was awful and beautiful in a way at the same time. She had a religious experience in the waves, and she credited that with being what kept her alive. I'm not going to read from that. I'm going to read from a slightly more comic section of the memoir. After my mother recovered, she made a very unusual decision. So instead of taking me and going back home to live with her family in British Columbia, she was Canadian and they were Mennonites, she decided to move back in with my father's family. And my father's father had been the commandant of the United States Marine Corps during Vietnam. So, Mennonites are pacifists. They don't believe in war. She decided, she's going to go a different way. So she went and moved in with my grandparents. And so not only was I immersed as a very small child in this very military environment, he was essentially military, retired royalty, in a humble way. But also it was just this potent stew of American history and culture and secrets and wars. And it was also an immersion in a very specific place, which was the ancestral home of his grandfather, which was in Tennessee, and where a lot of the stories in this book take place. I'll just quickly say it was originally a tavern built in 1790 at what was then the edge of the frontier. And it is a very Faulknerian sort of place. But I was a kid and I just kind of woke up there and one summer, and that was my life. So I'm going to read from a section. There were a lot of characters, some family members, some not related to us, who were around this house. And I'm reading from a short section from that chapter. And I'll say that the people in this chapter, they might be classified, as I read from the memoir, among the crazies. However, they never would have gone to DC on January 6th because they actually never left the county that they were born in. Like literally, they never had. Okay, take a sip of water.
Excuses.
Okay. James and Ella were, strictly speaking, Fairfield's caretakers, though the only time I ever heard them referred to that way was by Hortense Cooper, widow of Prentice Cooper, the former governor of Tennessee. My parents had led Hortense, their fellow dignitary, to the place under the clothesline where we all sat with our fly swatters in the afternoons. The breeziest spot in the backyard, its only drawback was its proximity to John Audrey's pasture, which, besides the flies, offered an aromatic bouquet that Ella poetically described as 3 kinds of shit: cow shit, pig shit, and chicken shit. Hortense must have felt disoriented and really couldn't be blamed when she turned to the toothless woman slunk into an aqua tube top next to her and inquired, "Do y'all enjoy being caretakers here?" Forever afterward, Ella referred to Hortense as that old heifer and barricaded herself inside whenever she came to visit, which wasn't often. It's hard to overestimate the violence with which the current state of James and Ella's house, originally the kitchen to the big house, removed a few yards from it to prevent fires, now cocooned in poison ivy vines and used as a fishing shed by people who'd never dream of actually living there, would make Ella turn in her grave. Ella didn't just live in that place. She inhabited it with the passion of a voodoo priestess, particularly after James died. 2 decades after her death, the walls still leach her high-octane nicotine, but the rooms of buckled paneling and uneven linoleum, always lit up like a blister when she was in them, have dried to timber, revealing their meanness. Without her things, photos of her great-great-nieces and nephews, the little blue-eyed devils Ella adored with the same vehemence she hated most everything else, her unlikely collection of befrocked porcelain-faced dolls that covered the bed where she and James had slept before she moved to the velour recliner, the TV's permanent glow. Without Ella in it, the house appears a shameful place in which to keep somebody. James and Ella were what Papa called the salt of the earth, a phrase that was intended to spin their less attractive qualities as virtues and explain or justify our relation to them. They'd lived in the small house for 40 years or so. Great-granddad, Papa's father, had recruited them as both help and company after the death of his wife, Claire. Before they met great-granddad, James and Ella had been living in the bona fide shack that floated on a mud skid among the cattle troughs to the left of our property, where John Audrey, the farmer next door, boarded his field hands. In my time, only the most down-and-out, pot-bellied, dirt-faced Calibans had lived there, and it was impossible to imagine James and Ella in such circumstances, for they were almost like members of the family. Almost. When the weather was warm enough, they lit the side bed of the big house, which had no insulation, moving to the small house when they needed heat or when we got to town each June. Then, at some point, they moved over there permanently, leaving behind only their deep freeze, which they kept stocked with walleye, cigarette cartons, and other provisions that we were meant to keep our hands off. They'd met at the country fair when James was working Old Man Farrell's farm and Ella was a cook at the Fairfield schoolhouse. He'd walked past her carrying a brown-bagged bottle and slurred, "Foller me, chicken. I'm full of corn." "I've been following him ever since," she'd conclude when telling this story as if it were her life's only piece of luck. Their romance had occurred in an inconceivable past where they rented cabins on a lake and got the ferocious fanged fish that were mounted on boards above their couch, a time presumably before Ella's skin had withered into one concentric wrinkle, and she spent her days arthritically locked into a lawn chair, sucking down Winston's, drinking sweet tea made with sulfur water, and chewing her cud. Even in this state, Ella vowed to wring the neck of any hussy who looked sideways at James. Was convinced that plenty did, maybe because of the bumper sticker on his pickup that read, "I break for blondes, brunettes, and redheads." In belted work pants, a crushed cap, and mesh shoes with his long filed fingernails pincered around a butt end, James was debonair in a way that no one could explain or deny, despite the fact that he was almost as awful looking as Ella. All of us, even Nana, were smitten with him, for he possessed that talent for mischief that's often irresistible to protected women. A staunch Marine Corps style standard of safety and security ruled all of Papa's affairs, and therefore ours. James, on the other hand, liked things a little bit evil. My mornings were consumed by trying to make him laugh, nuzzling his grizzle stash, smashing my face into his collar's red root cratered triangle, grappling his chin open to confirm the 6 count of his teeth until he hippo-chomped me without so much as smirking. I always wanted him on my team when we played croquet, for he was ruthless and wouldn't hesitate to one-handedly thwack his opponent's ball into the rotted meal of a tree stump or the riverbank's marshy holler, laughing like Jehoshaphat once he'd inflicted the damage, even if his opponent was only 7 years old. Thank you.
Yeah, let's hear it. Thank you for sharing that. The perfect sort of little teaser into the book. I agreed to this before I read the book, and I'm really glad I did. One, it's an excellent book, but two, there were a lot of points of surprising connectivity between our life stories. So be prepared for some weird coincidences here. So for example, you lost your dad when you were 3. I lost my mom when I was 7. So definitely resonated with a lot of the themes of like, when you tell people this fact, you end up sort of like consoling their grief. Right? They sort of, there's this reaction when you tell people about these tragic episodes early in childhood. The theme of your memoir here is sort of processing and grappling with your family's history in Tennessee and their sort of Confederate history and the sort of racist legacy that is passed down from generation to generation and how to uproot that. I just spent part of my sabbatical this summer on a road trip through Tennessee and Mississippi to grapple with my maternal family's Confederate history in Tennessee and Mississippi. So it's like the perfect story for me. And then also you grew up in this house that was built in 1790. And I also, in adulthood, in my first church where I worked, lived in the parsonage on the church property, which was built in 1789. So I really relate to that sense of being immersed in history and living inside of history. And sometimes I think in this neighborhood, the houses built a little more recently, but still historically, we forget the way we're immersed in that history. So I'd be curious to hear that sort of experience that you had of grappling with the way the spaces in which we live, the places in which we live, really sort of carry the story of the generations that came before us and impact the way we experience those histories.
Yeah, that's okay. We need to talk after.
Okay.
In the house in Tennessee, the way that history is in the house is just bizarre. I mean, it's so present. There's no way to ignore it. And what's so strange is, I mean, it's really like a house that you would go and visit somewhere, a preserved house. It has everything in it that it's always had, but it's abandoned and, nobody lives there all year. And so it's just kind of this rotting museum. So history, I mean, I have a line in the book that's something like history, white people's Western history and Southern history sort of exists as a preoccupation and a fetish, in addition to simply being there. Like partly it's just the fact that nothing's been moved, but partly it's the fact that the family at a certain time collected things so as to seem historical family. That was, they wanted to be historical.
Oh, there's like a prestige.
Yes. And I mean, that's a Southern thing, I think. Although not only Southern, that desire to be seen as, a historical family. People know about this family. I think it was a little overblown in my family's case. I don't think they were all that historical, but but they had this old house, and then the way it exists here is so interesting. I mean, a lot of people who are here tonight, I think, know about some of the history we've uncovered of our neighborhood and the housing legacy here. I think in the North, it can be a little more hidden, some of the darker histories. I mean, just one example that maybe some of you know, when we started doing our work with Spring Forward, investigate why Hamden is as segregated as it is and why Spring Glen is as white as it is. Somebody found their original deed that was still the active deed to their house, and it still had a whites only clause in it. So, segregation was the law in the North as well as the South. So our houses do contain a lot of secrets and laws that are.
Yeah, in that way, there's something so visceral in the memoir. There's 2 points where you talk about some of the historical artifacts in that house you grew up in. One being the bed that the enslaved George slept in, correct? With his mother? Am I remembering this detail correctly? Not quite. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds like a story.
Okay.
But
okay. Yeah. Well,
it's
you
a little different.
Trying to discern the difference between the myths that were passed down versus the reality. But then the other piece was the ledger book that they found. Yeah. That where a neighboring slave trader kept track of the humans that he trafficked. And it was just a visceral moment of like having it be so tangible, right? Mm-hmm. And that your grandfather that you knew personally, this enslaved gentleman, right, who was later freed after the Civil War, right? Like that we think of these histories as so far back, and yet they're so immediate. And then there's another theme throughout your book of that Northern arrogance of, it's down there. But what you were just talking about our own housing situation, right? That while the house you grew up in feels so visceral and close to slavery and racism, sometimes we forget how infused racism is in our own housing lives and that we exist in up here.
Yeah, and I think at the house in Tennessee, it is shocking to realize how recent that history is. I just read this book. It's a really good book by Michael Gora called Saddest Words, and it's about Faulkner and the Civil War. And I'd forgotten that one of the key scenes in Faulkner is about, I'm trying to remember I think it's Ike McCaskin finds these ledgers, these ledgers of enslaved people that his family had kept. And he has this same visceral reaction, and it causes him to relinquish the land. So this was not only in Faulkner's time, it was like Faulkner was writing about 30 years before. And it's still, and I'd forgotten that when I discovered these ledgers in my house. And certainly I don't think of myself as having the same sensibility as some Southerner living 30 years before. Things get so buried and we deal with them so little, in our country, but in my family as well, that the shock is fresh. It's and yet in plain sight. Like that ledger was just sitting in the desk for my entire childhood, and nobody ever looked at it.
So there's so many good things to go down, and I have like 5 different pathways I want to go, and so I'm trying to decide which way to go. I'm going to go with this one. I'm going to do a little meta analysis here, because that's the sort of weird thing about the memoir genre, is you're opening your life for character analysis in a way. And I'm so fascinated by the way grief functions throughout your book and the different ways different people engage with grief, including yourself. And so I'm noticing you go process the world through academia and poetry, right? For example, right now you just went to Faulkner, but in your book you spend a lot of time mapping your own stories onto one of Shakespeare's plays, which was really fascinating engagement with poetry, almost in the way that religion might engage with scripture, right? Helping you sort of give a lens to understand yourself and your experiences and your grief. By comparison, there's an extensive incident that you talk about with Ella, who is one of the women you talked about in the passage you read here, when her husband dies tragically. And the way she processes that grief is very guttural and emotional, and walking around at night and uncontrolled sort of fits and seeing the ghost of her husband. And then versus the poem that you noted about your mother and her processing this tragedy that she was right there involved with, and sort of going to the hymns of the church of her childhood as the thing that buoyed her and like brought her through it and gave her that strength to go through. So I'm really curious to hear more from you about how viewing your life through poetics creates sort of a deeper self-understanding for you, and or healing even as you go through. Like, what is it about poetry that or Shakespeare or any of the many poets that you quote in this book? How does that really transform your self-understanding and help you understand these experiences that you've had?
Yeah, well, I'll answer that in just a sec, but I have to just tell that the detail about Ella is just so when after James died, the man who I read about, they were so bizarrely close, even though, and she was like the grumpiest woman in all of history, but she adored James. And so the detail in the book is that she had to get her sister Blanche to come every night and lock the door from the outside so that in her grief, she wouldn't sleepwalk out and walk into the river because she didn't know how to swim. And she saw his ghost every night. So that's what Jack was talking about, like an unmediated grief that's just, overtakes a person. I'm going to quote another poet, but I think I think one aspect of it is Keats said that the poet is the least poetic creature in existence. So I think on some level that's true. He's talking about a poet's self-consciousness in some way kind of mediates experience for you in a way that can be problematic because you perceive so much that you don't experience it. And I'm sure that's true to some degree for me. And it's taken, I'm 47. It's taken this long for me to pull out this story that's really my origin story. When somebody asked me like, well, why wasn't your first book of poems about this? Why now? And I think it's really that I think the parts of that first chapter that talk about King Lear are part of what helped me pull it out. And I think the reason is that no matter how important a story seems or how how traumatic our trauma, how like can we make our own trauma important enough that it stands alone as a story? I mean, maybe we can. Maybe simply the fact that we've endured something horrible is enough to make other people read about it. But the truth is that most of us have them on some level, or we will if we don't already. And I would write this story over and over. I've probably been writing it all of my life as a writer. And I would then, even if I thought I'd told it really well about my father dying and my mother surviving, and I just think kind of like, so what? And I know that maybe sounds harsh because it is it's a formational story, but I think I just needed a way to make it connect to somebody else, to something or somebody else. The epigraph to Howard's End is only connect. I think it's one reason that we do write and read. You want to believe that no matter, it's a little bleak to decide that, King Lear is going to be the way that I'm going to connect with the world. But I don't know, it worked. So yeah, I think it's just, finding some place in which you feel that whatever you think of as unspeakable, unspeakable grief, unspeakable experience, actually there is some other consciousness that can comprehend it. And so that's what that allowed me to do, I think.
Well, I'd say even without the sort of direct personal connections that I felt, the part of the strength and beauty of this book is the way your personal stories connect to a larger picture. And there's, speaking of everybody suffers and how do we process that and engage that and connect it to something bigger, and you pull a funny trick in this book. You lure us in with personal connectivity, as you were just talking about, and then you're like, oh, by the way, these people enact horrible racism, right? And I am so intrigued by the way this book sort of dehumanizes people that we normally would dismiss as sort of perpetrators or racists, or it's a fascinating way to take a lot of times the sort of bigger theory, the macro level theory of all these injustices or inequities. We sort of dehumanize and disconnect from the complexities of human reality. And so it's fascinating to see you take those macro ideas and put them in a micro story of these real humans with real connections, and the ways that there's people in your life and in your family who both had racist experiences and expressions and viewpoints, but also did things to advance racial justice. Like there's a story about your dad who throughout the story very subtly expresses some racist viewpoints from his after his traumatic experiences in wartime, right? But then also passes an executive order to affirm black hair in the Marines and allow for afros and other sort of non-white hairstyles. And so I just find that sort of complexity very interesting. And I'm curious to hear from you, what was difficult about viewing people through this multi-layered lens, and what insights did you gain from exploring sort of the paradoxes within each of these people?
I think that's the hardest. That's the hardest question about the book, because I think my conscience pulls in two different directions on this, because, on the first level is if you're confronted with racism in a family member or, even or especially in somebody you really love, your conscience tells you have to speak up. Like that is wrong. And also your conscience on some level tells you to get away from it. You don't want to be associated with it. You don't want to aid it and abet it. And all of that is true. And that's that in some level is the conscience that drives the whole book. But at the same time, my conscience real, kept insisting. I mean, I think I wanted to just go that way. I mean, it wasn't like, I kind of just wanted to be done with all of this, and I live here in, New Haven, Connecticut, and I teach at Yale, and like, that's all really inconvenient, that's my, that's where I come from. And, but I realized I couldn't completely tell the truth if I described these people as if they had no virtues. And on some level, they just wouldn't come alive. So on some level, it was simply a writerly problem. I couldn't write them without writing their complexity. But I think the insight is, I guess it's really kind of that racism in America is a tragedy. I mean, I think that's kind of, and I teach Shakespeare, so one thing you learn or are bombarded with is the fact that in tragedies nobody comes away unscathed, and there's certainly people who are harmed worse and who are killed, and who horrific acts happen to, and then there's the people who either perpetrate them or who are associated with them in other ways. But in a tragedy, the people doing it are affected as well. And I think the tragedy is in this case is partly that it warped in some cases in small ways, in some cases in really large ways, warped people who had great capacity for love. And if they didn't have that, who knows what they could have done in their lives.
Fascinating. The way it warped people with great capacity for love. That is a powerful statement. And a lot of times in sort of racial justice circles, we talk about the push and pull of engaging or disengaging from family members with strong sort of prejudiced viewpoints. And I see that sort of process in your book as well. That sort of like return home, pull away from home, return home, pull away from home. And a lot of us, I think, are longing for some sense of like, yes, these people are not hopeless. This disconnect that seems to be widening and widening in our country, both in our macro world and our micro world, is not hopeless. In processing your relationships with these people and the way they've developed, and in developing a sort of empathy through understanding their traumas and their suffering, do you feel a sense of where are you in that sort of vein? I mean, it's not really what your book is about, but it seems like there is a piece of you grappling with like, how do I engage with these people whom I love and who love me? Yeah. But also there's a quote that you have in there about the point where the things that poked your, sort of pushed your buttons about Ella suddenly, it was like a switch flipped, and you suddenly, the amount that you loved her could no longer bear the amount that you were hurt by her, use of the N-word or racist expressions, or where are you on that sort of,
Well, I kind of, I don't know if you call it getting off easy, but the truth is that most of them are dead. So, that in a way makes it possible to be more optimistic.
It's a very morbid kind of hope.
Yeah. I mean, one thing because I was reading this other book, one thing I was thinking about is just how about how the difference between the difference between being traumatized and defining yourself by that trauma. As many white people in the South did, with the war. The difference between that and defining yourself by a wound, that's a kind of PTSD. And I think that a lot of people are kind of stuck in that like very reactive state. We seem to sort of be, and our culture as a whole seems to be in a reactive, traumatized state. We live with so much violence, and there's an inability to grieve. And to, I tried to get Jack to potentially pronounce this German word. So Germans have a word that it's got like really like 40 letters in it. And maybe it's because it means the process of working through or overcoming the past. Implied in this 40-letter word that we don't have in English is that one needs to accept one's own involvement before laying the past to rest and recognizing that complicity required that one first be able to mourn what has been lost. I guess that's a very roundabout way of saying that, like I hesitate to bring up the January 6th people and say, oh, the poor QAnon shaman, like, I'm sure he suffered so much. Like, that on some way is ridiculous. But at this time, it does feel to me as if we are just living in a country of people full of unresolved grief and rage and loss, who are unable to say, I wish things were once like this and I thought they were good, and I'm so sad that they're not what they thought they were. So I'm going to cry, and then I'm going to move on, and we're going to do something different. I guess I'm talking about, white people with grievances. I don't want to over empathize with them. But at the same time, I do think that there are a lot of people with a lot of trauma and who've experienced a lot of hardship, a lot of violence, and don't know how to deal with it. And that's a lot of what we're seeing.
And in some ways is the pull of racism or, extremist movements is, I have all this trauma, I have all this sense of the world turning against me, and here is certainty. Here is somebody else here I can project the things that are wrong in my life onto other people.
Yeah. Or maybe even just an outlet. Yeah. Or just I mean, it's dark. I guess I do. I want to say something optimistic. Maybe somebody could ask a different question.
Yeah. No. Well, I think the optimistic turn here is you have a great way of explaining exactly the word you just brought up. If you wouldn't mind doing page 128 in your book. A lot of times, in order to, a lot of our housing advocacy work and anti-racism work is about sort of uprooting the past, and so that we can lay a new foundation. And a lot of times the resistance to that is people saying like, no, we shouldn't bring up the terribleness of the past. Let's just say that we're done with racism and move on, right? Why do we have to bring up the past? And so there, the why remember paragraph, I think it beautifully captures both a sort of defense of memoir as a genre, but also why it's important for us to sort of revisit the past and re-examine our history, both personal and global.
Why remember? Why dredge things up? Why go into all of that again? These aren't really the questions of curious. When it comes to some memories, one's hope is often to stop remembering, or at least to remember less intensely. But as a poet, this often puts me in a bind because I believe in my memories as if they were articles of faith, that they rivet me for a reason, that if tested rigorously enough, they will yield some meaning bigger than themselves and maybe even the truth.
Yeah, right there. That I love that. Reveal some meaning bigger than themselves and maybe even the truth. So what truth in digging up the past? What truth have you uncovered?
Well, I think I'm sort of thinking about, it's too much to synopsize, but I'm thinking of the last chapter of the book, because it's I guess one truth I think in this book and in my life is that life will continue to surprise you and put out opportunities for another chance, at doing this work, which one thing I was thinking, since talking to you, Pastor Jack, that it's not really, as I said in the preface, I don't really think of it as political work. I really do think of it more as soul work. And I think that these, on some level, are really spiritual issues. And, thinking about the tragedy of warping a person's capacity to love, that's essentially a spiritual disease in my view. The last chapter of the book, something very strange happens, which is that when I was just, I guess, still in college, the descendants of the family of people who were enslaved by my ancestors contacted my grandfather and got in touch with him, and they started having reunions at our house in Tennessee. And they usually organize the reunions, but have been having them there for 25 years. So I'm an only child. I'm an only grandchild on both sides. I have no cousins. And the Singletons and McMahons, when I was like 25 years old, they baptized me into their family. It was a surprise baptism. I'm not sure about that, like doctrinally, about surprise baptisms, but that's what happened.
This country did to that family, they can do whatever they want.
And it was, I thought we were going swimming. I got out there and everybody was there, and it's truly incredible, and started singing One More River to Cross. And
you're like, we're singing now?
And then, and I walked up and they were like, we're baptizing. And the guys, Elwood McMahon, it was full body. They dunked me. And when I came up, they said, in the name of Jesus Christ, your sins are forgiven and you're a McMahon now.
Wow.
And they meant it. They just totally meant it. So,
we're laughing at that, but like how beautiful as a sort of act of reconciliation on so many levels.
It's so extraordinary. And I said, it's hard for me to feel optimistic. That's sort of true about the QAnon shaman. However, it is not hard for me to feel optimistic when I consider this story, which to me is so much the generosity and I just don't even know what to say. It renders me speechless because it's one of the biggest blessings in my life, and I never could have earned it with all of my, that's part of what the story's about, up until then, with all of my, progressive handwriting, anything I've done, I never could have anticipated that would happen. And you know,
Well, and that's the
it's
last
grace,
chapter is just amazing on so many levels because you examine that the question of agency and who has the power to tell the story of their ancestor, and who has the power to forgive. And it's funny, when we first started talking about this book, I was like, oh yeah, and we can sort of dive into some of the theological and religious themes, and you're like, there aren't really that many. It's like every single page has something spiritual or religious on it, and so I have like 5 more hours of conversation questions, but the teaser I'll sort of leave us on to get people to read the book is the question of, why did George come back after the Civil War, freed slave, chooses to come back and take care of your family? And you sort of examine this question with that his descendants. And I have a theory that wasn't in the book about why. So we'll talk about that later. But I don't want to spoil the book for you all. So you're just gonna have to read it and come up with your own theories. But I think this sort of question of memory has a pull on both sides, right? Memory as healing, but then you also talk about one of your relatives, cousin Robert, was it? Who was the one who gave you the Birth of a Nation? Yeah, cousin Robert, who was like defending Birth of a Nation, and you talked about his house as a fortress nostalgia, and I think that is nostalgia as a tool for racism. Is as a sort of veil for racism that hides it from our understanding and our view, is very prevalent. And especially here, as we're sort of talking about uncovering the history of the neighborhood, I think about the imagery too of the relative who fixed, quote unquote, your chimney, and part of it was there was no foundation, and so he did a foundation for the chimney but not for the house, and then the chimney was crooked, and like decades later a slight breeze knocked over the chimney. So I think there's something beautiful there about, like, you have to, as a metaphor for, like, you have to go back and actually dig a proper foundation, to revisit history, not as a sort of idol, but to revisit history, to re-examine it. And so as we sort of shift towards opening it up for questions from those who are gathered here, I want to, while they're thinking of their questions, I want to give you space to talk about the advocacy work of Spring Forward, which is a neighborhood group that Danielle helps lead with Marissa, about that sort of looks at this history of racism in housing and through a housing lens, and what we can do to dig up that foundation and build a better foundation. So are there particular efforts that you want to like rally the troops behind?
Well, I think that's a great description. You can visit our Facebook page, which tells you a bit more. But yeah, basically we're just hoping to bring more equitable housing to Hamden and to Spring Glen. And part of most of what we've done so far is simply uncover the current history in order to understand why things are the way they are now. A lot of it has to do with zoning codes, and we can answer any questions about that you would like. But yeah, I it's probably getting on in time here. Maybe we should. Does anybody have questions?
It's interesting that not everyone has that history. And I'm thinking about my father, who was an immigrant, and I cannot go beyond my father. When I think about my history, I know when he was born. I think because he lied about his age to get into the military. And it's striking that there are many immigrants who cannot follow the history that you so elegantly expressed in your book.
So just to repeat for those who couldn't hear, since we don't have a mic to pass, the question is about the families whose history and lineage has been erased, whether because of immigration or various other reasons, including slavery.
Yeah, right. And that's of course so true for African American people in this country. And so one thing that's so unusual about the house in Tennessee is that the McMahon and Singleton descendants know that this is the place that their ancestors lived. And so it's very important to them to be, to preserve that. But
Reclaim
also,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. So, it's very important to me, even though it's very difficult to maintain that house, which I, for better or worse, inherited somewhat recently. The reason for doing it is that that's basically invaluable to really it's hundreds of people. Yeah.
Well, no, from my perspective, I think even if those histories have been erased through immigration, it's not just an American history; it's a global history in a lot of ways. It's all of our history, and so the process of reclaiming that history is important, understanding it, and the ways that some immigrant communities are adopted into that whiteness, into that history, into that legacy in ways that other immigrant communities are not. And so sort of grappling with that discomfort, I think, is important. Julie, I saw your hand up.
Curious to know, to any other living members of your family or people who live in that area who've read the book, what has the reaction been?
Oh, very good question. For those who could not hear, what has been the reaction of any remaining family members or people from that region?
Like I said, there aren't many who live there. I've been kind of surprised. So who I have heard a lot of reactions from are the residents of Falcons Landing, the military retirement community where my mother lives. A lot of people, it's called Falcons Landing. There's a lot of falcon-looking men, they're all been, in the military or in the State Department, that kind of thing. I thought that there would be a tremendous amount of pushback. I thought my mother would maybe be shy about the book, but it's very strange. She's like my publicist at Falcons Landing. And I guess some people kind of say like, oh, your daughter needs to learn some more about history, but for the most part, they seem to like it because it talks about, because there's characters in the book who are Marines.
Yes.
And so they enjoy that. And also because, the Marines are, they're a diverse group of people, so I was surprised at how willing they were to read about racism, but
well, I also hypothesize that there's not enough content out there or opportunities to engage and openly acknowledge the trauma that soldiers experience, right?
And that's a lot of the book. Yeah.
I think you also provide a very fascinating model for engaging people that otherwise would be shut down by conversations of racism, because that trick I talked about, you humanize them first, but that you don't hold back from naming the racism and calling out the racism. And I think there's something powerful about that. As a way to engage people who might otherwise have shut down to the conversation.
Well, and that's, I think in terms of thinking about how some of these things might play out in our lives. And I was being a little pessimistic. And, sometimes when we encounter, even in our housing work, like if you encounter somebody who really doesn't agree with you, you can get you can feel the fire breathing at you, and it gets really intense really fast. And I think that I don't think of it as a trick, but maybe it was a little tricky of me.
We'll call it a poetic tool.
Yeah. I think that it is sort of what we have to do if we want to try to move on in our country, is like engage with people as people first, like recognize, no matter what they believe, that they are a human soul. They are, and try to relate to them with respect for their humanity first, before you suck it to them. No, just kidding. But until you really have to make your point. But
you need both, right?
Yeah,
you need the
both.
compassionate engagement and you need the harsh reality check, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions?
It's not really a question, but it sort of like brings up this sort of responsibility of a writer, if you can use it, which is not everybody can write what they feel. And so when you say something like that, in a way, you sort of give permission for other people to acknowledge this thing. I mean, it's basically what you already said, but I think probably the people at your mother's, senior living place or wherever she is, maybe catharsis might be a strong word, but like a permission to be like, yes, this is something I didn't know how to say myself.
Yes, for those who couldn't hear, responsibility of a writer was a fascinating topic to open up. So would you like to reflect on that?
That's just so true, because I'll just give you a quick example. My grandmother, who was, she called herself, the real title for the commandant's wife is the commandant's wife, but she called herself the first lady of the corps, so that gives you a sense of what she was like. But for my whole life, she was kind of just mute, in a sort of zombified state. And I guess I maybe shouldn't quite give it away because of what happens in the book, but essentially she had been at Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
She, her husband was the commandant of the Vietnam War while both of her sons were in Vietnam, and numerous other traumatic events in her life. And my mother was terrified of me exposing that she'd been diagnosed with mental illness and had actually been on heavy duty tranquilizers my whole childhood. But the people who we were worried about just said, "Oh, I'm so glad that somebody said that." They'd been carrying it as a secret too. So, yeah.
Maybe we'll do one more question. Yeah, Doug.
I'm wondering about your own story. Given that every life has trajectory and points of inflection, given the environment that you grew up in, given where you are, why are you not there being like the people you describe in your book? What were the key moments or points or experiences that caused you to take a different track?
Well, he's a main character in the book, but my grandfather, I think it was him, he's a complicated person, but it's so strange to me now thinking back, my grandmother was such a feminized figure of the old South, and yet he would say things to me like kind of in secret, like, if you want to be a writer, you should do that. Like, you can do that, and I'll help you, if I can. And he loved Shakespeare. He I think maybe my love language came from him too, because he was just one of those people who loved words, and he'd say, he had, there's a lot of his mottos and quotes in the book, just because he was one of those people who spoke in aphorisms, and one was, he loved Macaulay's History of England, and he would just say, well, that's one of my favorite books, is Macaulay's History of England. You can't believe anything he says, but he sure does know how to use the English language. There's probably other reasons too, but yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I'll keep thinking about that.
Maybe that's the note of hope.
Yes.
The optimism we can end on is that we are not trapped by the generational traumas that have been handed down to
Yeah.
us, who defined by our trauma, that in a new life, because this is a question I have also been grappling with in my own family's history. And I'll say two of those ways that you can engage in escaping that history and healing that history. One, if you want to engage in the Spring Forward work that was discussed here, wave your hand, Marissa, in the back. Go see Marissa, and she'll connect you to that group, or talk to Danielle. And if you are interested in how to look up whether or not your house deed has the racist language in it, and how to fill out the form to sort of renounce that racist language in your deed, you can talk to me or Doug and Susie right here. I'm gonna put you on the spot. Go ahead, wave your hands there, because their extended family member has sort of taken it on as a project to help anybody who wants look up whether or not their deed has this racist language in it, and help you fill out the form to get rid of that racist language, or at least. And with that, I offer a great deal of gratitude to our author, Danielle Chapman. Let's hear it. Thank you all. You're welcome to mingle. There are books in the back. I highly recommend that you buy it. It is a very enjoyable read and really brings up a lot of fascinating layers about life and history. So
thank you so much, Jack, for, I mean, there's such a great read of the book. And thank you, Julie. Thank you, Best Video. Thank you, Hampton.